Hey, everybody, James here. Oh, wait, no. Sorry. Sorry. Sometimes I get a little confused, This is Theoretical Bullshit, once again, and this is yet another response to Veritas 48 regarding his Presumption of Atheism series. But first, Noah, I have a very serious query for you. Does it ever bother you that your parents named you after the Bible's most famous freeballing alcoholic? I'm just curious. Okay, so you started with the definition of atheism, and in the interest of time, I don't really need to say anything more on that. It's clear that you hear what I'm saying, and you agree with me for the most part. I will say this, though. In the end, you're still insisting on a definition for atheism that, despite your belief that it's more traditional, does not work because it does not describe everyone who would consider themselves an atheist. Whereas I only use a definition of atheism that does work because it describes everyone who would consider themselves an atheist. Theo Warner gets on my case all the time because in my videos, when I use the word Christian, I'm typically only referring to a very specific kind of Christian, the born-again, creationist, biblical inerrantist, original sin, Trinity, end times prophecy type of Christian. And Theo rightfully points out to me that this is very misleading, as there are millions and millions of people in the world who would consider themselves Christian that just don't fit these criteria. But I don't actually, argue with him about it or insist that his definition is wrong or that mine is more traditional. What a waste of time. Why would I do that? His definition works better because it describes everyone who would consider themselves a Christian. Mine doesn't. And when someone lets me know that the way I use the word Christian doesn't address them, I say, yeah, you're right. You shouldn't treat my video as if it applies to you. I'm just saying. So then you try really, really hard to use the term metaphysical naturalist against me. Here's what you said, quote, "You are a metaphysical naturalist. You state this in your video and in the script you provided me. And metaphysical naturalism is a position that says that nature is all there is. Yet you've made it very clear that you don't want to claim that no gods exist. But aside from pantheism, that is precisely what metaphysical naturalism entails. So I don't know how you can reconcile this. This seems like a very valid contradiction. Further, this ironically puts you quite close, if not into, the category of atheists you believe is a myth," end quote. Now this is really funny to me because I've been extremely clear on what my exact position is on the existence of gods. I said that I'm an agnostic atheist toward many gods, meaning that I don't believe I can know with certainty that they don't exist. Yet there are other gods, such as the Christian God, which I do believe I can know with certainty don't exist. However, I don't believe in any god of any kind, rendering me an atheist, nor do I believe in anything else that could be considered supernatural. I maintain that there are no sufficient reasons for supposing that any such phenomena exist, and that this is enough to conclude that a belief in them is unreasonable. It is for this reason that in my life I operate from the working assumption that they do not exist. What's the best available term to describe this position? I think metaphysical naturalist is. And I'm clearly open to something better. But I've been very open about the fact that I don't claim to know or have absolute certainty that no supernatural phenomena exist. And if, unlike me, you understand the term metaphysical naturalist to mean that I do make such a claim, then you shouldn't use that term to describe me. It's as simple as that. There's no contradiction here. So no, Noah, I do not fall into this particular category of atheist. And you still haven't been able to show me that anyone else participating in this conversation does, either. In fact, let's put our money where our mouth is. If you're an atheist and you're watching this and you maintain that this syllogism is perfectly sound logic, then let me know in the comments section of this video. I suspect that the reason you think so many atheists hold to this position is because in your discourse with those atheists, you have projected your understanding of the terms they use onto their position without bothering to verify if it was in fact accurate to do so. The reason I suspect this is the case, Noah, is because you've done it to me twice now, in a row. Okay, so then you went on to say this, quote, "Here we've just elucidated two of your positions. One is that you believe no supernatural deities exist, and the other is that all you are required to do as a non-believer is demonstrate that it's unreasonable for us to suppose God exists. That is exactly the type of person, the type of combination that you claim is a myth, Scott, and unless you think you don't exist, you have a large problem here," end quote. Survey says. No. What you just described is most certainly not the type of person I'm claiming is a myth. I never said that as a non-believer, demonstrating that it's unreasonable for us to suppose God exists is enough to show that God doesn't exist. In fact, I explicitly said the opposite in the quote you used in your video. What I said was that demonstrating that it's unreasonable for us to suppose God exists is enough to win the argument. In other words, while I may provide positive arguments against the existence of certain gods, my intention is not to persuade you that no God exists, because I don't even claim to know that with certainty. My intention is to persuade you that it is unreasonable for you to suppose that a God exists. Because once I've done that, there's nothing left to say. You'll either abandon the belief, or you'll hold on to it with the acknowledgement that doing so is unreasonable. And if the latter happens, what am I supposed to do? Reason with you? No, that's absurd. I move on. The debate's over. You continue, quote, remember when I said that what frustrates me here on YouTube is that people don't listen to what I'm actually saying? Well, you kind of just did that. I stated explicitly throughout the last couple of my videos that none of my intentions have been to defend the Christian God in these discussions, end quote. Well then, I guess I think I've just... I think I've invented a new fallacy. When you argue against a position that your opponent doesn't hold, that's called a straw man, right? But you seem to be objecting to the fact that I've argued against the position you do hold instead of one you don't. Let's call it the Tin Man fallacy. Oh my God, we could be famous. I get that you were never trying to defend the Christian God, and when I made this criticism, I had already acknowledged that there are certain gods for which we should not expect to see evidence. I know it frustrates you when someone isn't paying attention to what you say. It frustrates me too. But that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is that I am paying attention to what you say, apparently more closely than you are. See, I'm not calling you out because you're defending a version of God that's just less specific than yours. I'm calling you out because you're defending a version of God whose existence is mutually exclusive with yours. You say that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence if we should expect to see evidence for the God in question. Well, what if we should expect to see evidence for the God in question? Well, you've already granted that if this is the case, it would be evidence for that God's non-existence. And I'm arguing that such would be the case if the God in question were the Christian God. So we have two contradictory propositions here, A and B. Proposition A is that the universe was created by a God for whom we should expect to see an abundance of evidence. Proposition B is that the universe was not created by a God for whom we should expect to see an abundance of evidence. Both A and B cannot be true simultaneously. What I'm arguing is that you, Noah, affirm Proposition A, but are in fact defending its negation, Proposition B. So if the God you're defending in this conversation exists, then the Christian God doesn't exist. And wouldn't that be a silly mistake for a Christian apologist to make? This is why I'm saying, who are you kidding? You may or may not agree that believing in the Christian God affirms Proposition A. Nevertheless, I've presented an argument that it does. And until you can demonstrate that believing in the Christian God affirms Proposition B, not A, your reasoning here is truly self-defeating. I have no objection to the point you were trying to make. I'm just letting you know how poorly that point serves you. I'm just looking out. That's all. Now, it seems like both of us are declining to show our hands with respect to the problem of non-belief. So that's cool. I'm going to skip over that, except for the part where you said this, quote, I find it interesting that you think Christians have not been able to adequately account for the problem of evil, end quote. I never mentioned the problem of evil. Never brought it up, not once. When I mentioned unnecessary suffering, I hadn't departed yet from the problem of non-belief. I think your confusion stems from the fact that you're just not that familiar with the problem of non-belief, but that argument deals largely with the issue of suffering. More specifically, it deals with the suffering that takes place in hell on account of people being unconvinced that God actually exists. But of course, we'll get to that, so moving on. Now, in addressing the issue of design and optimality, you seem to be confusing me actually making arguments with me describing arguments that can be made. And as a result of that confusion, you devoted large portions of your video to providing rebuttals to these arguments that I haven't actually made yet, which creates more work for me. So, thanks a lot, Dick. You said this, quote, can you please tell me how it's supposed to follow that a human body with any slight enhancement in optimality is going to be very strong evidence for the existence of God? No, it wouldn't, and frankly, you and I both know that atheists would not be compelled by this, end quote. You know what? You're right. You're absolutely right. And if I had actually said what you were falsely claiming I said, then by golly, I'd have another thing coming. But I didn't say that any slight enhancement in the optimality of the human body would be strong evidence for God. See, now we're back to that whole listening thing again. I said that if our bodies could not be designed more optimally for their purpose in any conceivable way, it would be strong evidence for an intelligent creator. I mean, Noah, you just quoted me saying this, and then you turn around and completely botch it when you repeat it back. Come on. Would you really argue that it would not be strong evidence for an intelligent creator if our bodies could not be designed more optimally in any conceivable way? You continue, quote, "Further, I have no idea what an optimal human being looks like. Can you tell me what that means?" End quote. No. No, I can't. I don't know what it would look like either. But you have to understand something. We don't need to know what it would look like. We only need to know what it wouldn't look like. You even acknowledge in your video that 2 different pipes for breathing and digesting would be more optimal of a design than we have now. Well, I can tell you this, Noah. If our bodies could not be designed more optimally for their purpose in any conceivable way, then they would at least include that feature, if not something completely different that's even better. What can we infer from this? That our bodies are clearly not designed as optimally as they could be. The question is, why? The proposition that we were designed by a perfect creator who was not inexplicably operating light years below their level of capability has extremely poor explanatory power, since the proposition fails to account for the underwhelming design of our bodies. If we were indeed created by an intelligent designer, it is reasonable for us to infer that the intelligence of this designer was quite limited. But that's not the designer you're positing. If what you say is true, that as an apologist you're just starting with the observable world and making inferences based on that, then how did you arrive at the conclusion that the suboptimal design of our bodies is better explained by a perfect designer than an imperfect one? Because, Noah, to me that seems like a complete non sequitur. If you're making the claim that it's more reasonable for us to infer that a perfect creator would design a suboptimal human body than it is to infer that a perfect creator would design an optimal human body, then it falls on you to demonstrate that. How did you arrive at that conclusion? Now, as for your demand that I remake videos I've done in which I offer arguments against the existence of God, just for your viewing pleasure, I'm not going to do that. I made them already, and I offer them to you for your scrutiny, but there are too many videos that I need to make, and remaking ones that I don't find problems with would just be a really bad economy of my time. So I am disinclined to acquiesce your proposal, Noah. Okay, let's wrap this up, shall we? When I said that even if the absence of evidence for a given God were not evidence of its absence, it would still be evidence that the belief in that God is unreasonable, you responded with the following, quote, "Even if you don't realize it, you are assuming a profoundly evidentialist criteria in which one is unreasonable in believing a given thing if they have no evidence for the thing in question, in this case God. Yet at the same time, you've provided no evidence to think that the principle itself, the one you assumed in your very statement, is true, which means that your view is literally self-refuting," end quote. Okay, clearly you disagree with the notion that the absence of evidence for a given God renders it unreasonable to suppose that that God exists, but I wasn't simply referring to the absence of empirical evidence. I was referring to the absence of all evidence, as in the absence of sufficient reason. Throughout my video, I use those two terms interchangeably, and I already know you're on board with this because in another one of your presumption of atheism videos, you acknowledge that reason and evidence are inseparable. So are you really telling me that you think it's reasonable to suppose God exists even when there's no sufficient reason to suppose God exists? No. I will not even consider that as a possibility because you're not a fool. You're just using the word evidence inconsistently between videos, and that's fine. In any case, I know where you're getting this stuff. You're borrowing from Planninga, and yes, I've seen the video you did arguing that belief in God without evidence is justified. And for right now, I'm going to ignore how riddled with fallacy that argument is and just assume its legitimacy for the sake of clarifying things with you. Let's pretend I've gotten you to acknowledge that you have no sufficient reason for supposing God exists. At this point, as far as I'm concerned, our discourse has ended. My concern is not that you thought believing in God was justified or warranted. My concern is that you thought it was reasonable. And from now on, you can still rationalize believing in God any way you like. Call it warranted, call it justified, I don't care. as long as you're honest about not having sufficient reason for thinking it's actually true. Now, what if this misrepresents what you're saying? What if you maintain that terms like warranted and justified mean the same thing as having sufficient reason? Well, then what I mean when I say I've demonstrated to you that you have no sufficient reason is that I've demonstrated you're unwarranted and unjustified, including having debunked that argument from Plantinga. So your objection is moot in all cases. Anyway, I'm exhausted from talking about this, and I suspect that I'm just as ready to move on as you are. So I think both of our subscribers would appreciate a concerted effort to start debating about God and stop debating about debating. Anyway, take care, man.